Hey everybody, today we're going to continue our look at open economies by discussing the impact that macroeconomic policy can have on exchange rates, particularly focused at monetary policy. So we'll discuss briefly the difference between what's known as a devaluation and a revaluation of currency, and we'll look at the effects that monetary policy can have not only on the foreign exchange market, but also in the overall aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So first things first, we talked about fixed exchange rates in a previous lesson, and we talked about how the government can choose to either raise the exchange rate or lower the exchange rate, and we discussed the policies they can pursue to try and achieve that preferred exchange rate value. We have terms that go with that. So if a government chooses to reduce its exchange rate, to devalue their currency, it's called a devaluation. If they choose to increase the exchange rate or appreciate their currency, it's called a revaluation. And the decision to pursue a devaluation or revaluation has impacts on overall economic output and therefore helps governments address output gaps. We also said that with a fixed exchange rate policy, macroeconomic policy, particularly monetary policy, is limited because of using monetary policy to affect your exchange rate prevents you from using it to close output gaps. But when you have a floating exchange rate policy, governments are free to use monetary policy to try and either close a recessionary gap or a inflationary gap. So what we want to look at here is that how monetary policy has additional impacts, not only on output, but also on the exchange rate and in the foreign exchange markets, and how that enhances the impact that monetary policy can have on aggregate demand. So we'll look at an example. Let's pretend that the central bank has decided to lower interest rates because they want to pursue expansionary monetary policy. They want to close a recessionary gap. If the central bank were to follow a policy like that, we would see them increase the money supply, which is causing interest rates to drop. And because there's more money in the money supply, we'll see an increase in the supply of loanable funds within the banking system, which causes real interest rates to also fall, as we learned in Unit 3 and Unit 4 when looking at monetary policy. So this reduction in real rates of return makes investment in this country less attractive to foreign investors. That is, people have a choice as to where to send their capital. And we learned in a previous lesson that capital generally flows to countries with higher rates of real interest or real return. So when the central bank followed an expansionary monetary policy, they drove interest rates down and they reduced the real interest rates that investors can receive, which is going to make this country's currency less attractive. If we look in the foreign exchange market, we would see then that if the interest rates in the United States fall relative to, let's say, Europe, then investors would like to get out of the US dollar and into euros. So we will see an increase in the supply of US dollars in the foreign exchange market so that those people who have dollars can get more euros in exchange. So that right shift in supply of US dollars causes a depreciation in the value of the dollar relative to the euro. So that outflow of funds from the United States to Europe depreciates the dollar as more dollars are being offered for exchange. At the same time, you'll see a left shift in the demand for dollars because now there's fewer needed in the market. Certainly Europeans no longer want US dollars. Lower foreign investment means less demand for the currency, which causes that price to drop even more. So we see this depreciation of the dollar relative to the euro. When the currency depreciates, that has an impact on net exports. So what happens to the current account when the dollar depreciates and why? Well, what we've learned in the past is that when the dollar depreciates, the dollar cannot buy as many goods from Europe, let's say, because it's weaker. So Americans will buy fewer goods from Europe than they did before. And Europeans, because their euro has appreciated relative to the dollar, will be buying more American-made goods than before. And so the current account for the United States should move towards a positive direction. If it was negative before, it will be closer to zero. If it was positive, it will become an even more positive number than it was in the past. What impact does that have on the overall market and the overall economy? Well, when the U.S. increases its net exports, it will cause aggregate demand to shift to the right. And so we'll see that monetary policy intended to help grow the economy and to get the economy's output gap to shrink accomplishes that goal, not only because investing and consuming is cheaper domestically, but also because it will drive a depreciation in the currency, which leads to an increase in the current account, which also helps impact overall aggregate demand, causing our model to see aggregate demand shift to the right and increase overall output. So the conclusion to draw from all of this is rather simple, and that is that monetary policy has additional impacts in an open economy. Monetary policy is even more powerful than we realized when we were doing just closed economies. That change in the exchange rate affects aggregate demand just as much as the change in interest rates did, and has that compounding effect in the overall output of an economy. We have some more problems to work through in class. I'll be there to answer your questions, and I will see you soon.